The gold, the general, and the order that shocked Washington. The vault doors groaned open beneath the Bavarian mountains, and what lay inside glittered like a dragon's hoard. Crates stacked to the ceiling. Gold bars stamped with the Reich's eagle. Bags of coins. Priceless paintings ripped from European walls. Jewelry taken from trembling hands. Wealth looted from nations. From families. From the dead. It was April 1945. Nazi Germany was collapsing. Berlin was burning. Hitler would be dead within days. And General George S. Patton stood at the edge of history, staring at what may have been the greatest treasure trove ever uncovered in modern warfare. But it wasn't the gold that made the moment explosive. It was what Patton wanted to do with it. Because while Washington saw restitution, accounting, and international committees, Patton saw opportunity. He believed the war wasn't ending. It was just changing enemies. And what he proposed to do with Hitler's gold stunned General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and nearly ignited a political firestorm inside the Allied command. Patton was not a cautious man. He was a cavalryman born too late for sabers and too early for satellites. He believed in speed, shock, and momentum. His Third Army had ripped across France with terrifying efficiency, smashing through German defenses like a steel tidal wave. But as American forces pushed into southern Germany and Austria, they discovered something far more complicated than retreating Wehrmacht divisions. They discovered the Reich's hidden wealth. The Nazis had looted Europe methodically. Banks in Belgium. Art collections in France. State reserves in the Netherlands. Even the personal possessions of Holocaust victims had been catalogued and stored. Teeth melted down. Wedding rings sorted. Family heirlooms stripped of identity. Much of it was hidden in salt mines, caves, and alpine fortresses. And as Patton's forces uncovered these caches, he began forming an idea that would make his superiors deeply uncomfortable. The Soviet Union. To the American public, the Soviets were allies, grim, determined, bleeding millions of lives to crush Hitler from the east. To Patton, they were the next threat. He had watched the Red Armies advance. He had seen their methods. He distrusted Stalin completely. And he believed, almost prophetically, that Europe was not heading toward peace, but toward a new kind of conflict. He told aides privately that within months, America might regret empowering Moscow. And then he made the suggestion. Instead of locking the gold away under international oversight, instead of waiting for commissions and diplomats, what if the United States used it? What if it became leverage? What if it funded a rapid stabilization of Western Europe, rearming anti-communist forces, strengthening defenses, securing Germany under American influence before the Soviets tightened their grip? Some accounts suggest he even floated the idea of rebuilding segments of the German military, not the Nazi ideology but the fighting force, to serve as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. To Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, this was not bold. It was dangerous. The war had not even officially ended. Millions were dead. The world demanded justice, not strategy games with looted treasure. Hitler's gold was evidence. It was proof of crimes. It belonged to victims and governments that had been robbed. And more importantly, the alliance with the Soviet Union, fragile as it was, had to hold until Germany formally surrendered. Using the gold for geopolitical maneuvering could shatter that alliance overnight. Eisenhower valued order. Patton valued momentum. Eisenhower saw diplomacy. Patton saw inevitability. And between them stood mountains of stolen gold. What happened next would expose the deepest fault lines inside the Allied command. It would reveal how close the United States came to pivoting from one war straight into another. And it would show that even before the Cold War officially began, some men were already preparing to fight it. When Patton's Third Army pushed into Bavaria in April 1945, the fighting was nearly over. German resistance was collapsing into scattered pockets of desperation. Entire divisions surrendered without firing a shot. Officers shot themselves rather than face capture. Civilians flooded roads in terrified columns. But intelligence reports began circulating through Allied channels about something else. Something hidden. Convoys moving south under SS Guard. Rail cars vanishing from Berlin. Crates transferred into the Austrian Alps. The Reich, even in death, was hiding its fortune. One of the most dramatic discoveries came at the Merkur salt mine in central Germany. Acting on tips from local workers, American forces descended into the tunnels and uncovered what seemed almost mythological in scale. Over 8,000 gold bars. Hundreds of bags of gold coins. Foreign currency from across Europe. Artwork. Rembrandts, Vermeers, priceless manuscripts. And shelves filled with sacks labeled with chilling precision. Rings, watches, eyeglasses. personal property stripped from concentration camp victims. The total value was staggering, hundreds of millions of dollars in 1945 currency. Today it would be worth billions. The scale was so immense that even seasoned officers stood silent when the vaults were illuminated. It was not just wealth. It was evidence. It was the financial skeleton of the Third Reich. And when word reached General Patton, his reaction was not awe. It was calculation. Patton had already been uneasy about the post-war arrangements being drafted in distant rooms by diplomats. The Yalta Conference had taken place only months earlier. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had divided influence across Europe with signatures and promises. But Patton did not trust promises. He had read history obsessively. He believed in cycles of power. He believed that nations, like armies, moved according to force, not sentiment. The Red Army was already occupying Eastern Europe. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, falling into Moscow's orbit one by one. Soviet troops were not behaving like temporary liberators. They were entrenching. And now the Americans were sitting on a mountain of gold. To Patton, this was not a bookkeeping matter. It was leverage. He began speaking privately, carefully at first, to select officers. He asked pointed questions. Who would control the redistribution of these assets? How long would investigations take? What authority would the Soviets demand over seized Nazi wealth? Could the United States act independently? His staff understood what he was circling around. If the Soviets emerged from the war with territorial control and financial compensation, their influence would surge. But if America acted decisively, if it used captured assets to stabilize Western Europe quickly, it could prevent a power vacuum. The gold could be converted into immediate reconstruction capital. Factories rebuilt. Infrastructure restored. Government strengthened. And perhaps most controversially, security forces organized under American oversight. Patton believed that starving, unstable societies turned toward extremism. He had seen what chaos did to Germany after World War I. He blamed punitive policies and economic collapse for Hitler's rise. He did not want Europe drifting into communist revolutions born from hunger and desperation. To him, using the gold strategically was not theft. It was prevention. But this thinking clashed directly with Allied agreements. Under established policy, captured Nazi assets were to be catalogued and redistributed to rightful owners or governments that had been robbed. The process would involve commissions, audits, documentation, legal review. It would take years. Patton thought years were a luxury the West did not have. He began voicing a far more radical notion in private circles, one that would eventually reach Eisenhower. Germany, he argued, would not remain disarmed forever. The Soviet Union was too strong, too aggressive, too ideologically driven. If conflict erupted between the former allies, Western Europe would need a defensive backbone, and quickly. There were millions of German soldiers still alive. Many were professionals, not fanatics. Many despised the Nazis but had fought for their country. Patton saw them not as eternal enemies, but as potential future allies. The suggestion alone was explosive. Rearming Germans months after liberating concentration camps? Using Nazi gold to do it? It sounded outrageous. But in Patton's mind it was realistic. The Russians are not our friends, he reportedly told close aides. We defeated the wrong enemy. Whether those exact words were spoken is debated by historians, but the sentiment was real. Patton distrusted Soviet intentions profoundly. He began pressing for flexibility in occupation policies. He resisted overly harsh denazification measures when he believed they removed capable administrators. He spoke too freely to journalists about cooperation with former German officers. Each comment sent ripples upward through command. And eventually Eisenhower confronted the problem directly. Eisenhower was no fool about the Soviets. He understood the tension simmering beneath the alliance. But he also understood timing, optics, and politics. The American public had sacrificed enormously to defeat Hitler. The war in Europe was barely over. Japan was still fighting in the Pacific. Families were grieving. Any appearance that American generals were already maneuvering toward confrontation with the Soviet Union could shatter the fragile unity holding the coalition together. Moreover, the legal status of the gold was clear. It was not American property. It was stolen wealth. Using it for strategic purposes, even noble ones, risked international scandal. If Washington appeared to be diverting Nazi assets for its own geopolitical agenda, the United States could be accused of becoming what it had just defeated. And then there was Stalin. If word reached Moscow that American commanders were considering using seized German resources to strengthen anti-Soviet positions, trust would collapse overnight. Occupation zones could erupt in tension. Prisoners could be mistreated. Lines of control could harden immediately. The war might end with guns silent, but hostility roaring. Eisenhower believed stability required discipline. Patton believed stability required strength. The clash was inevitable. Reports of Patton's comments and policy preferences reached SHEF headquarters, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Concern grew that the Third Army commander was speaking too candidly about post-war alignments. In one meeting, Eisenhower reportedly made it clear, American policy would not pivot toward hostility with the Soviet Union. Not yet. The gold would be secured, cataloged, protected. It would not be weaponized politically. Patton did not openly defy the order. But he did not conceal his frustration. He saw hesitation where he believed urgency was required. He saw diplomacy where he saw danger. And his blunt remarks did not stop. In September 1945, he gave interviews criticizing denazification and suggesting that former Nazis were being treated unfairly compared to communists. The statements caused outrage. To many, it sounded as though Patton was minimizing the crimes of the regime. To him, it was practical governance. The optics were disastrous. Eisenhower removed him from command of the Third Army and reassigned him to the 15th Army, a largely administrative role tasked with writing the history of the war. It was effectively a sidelining. Officially, it was about public statements and discipline. Unofficially, many historians argue that deeper strategic disagreements played a role. Patton had stepped beyond acceptable policy boundaries. He had suggested a future war before the current one had even cooled. He had looked at Hitler's gold and seen not restitution, but readiness. And that frightened his superiors. Then, in December 1945, only months after the war ended, Patton was injured in a car accident in Germany. He died days later. The timing fueled rumors for decades. Conspiracy theories flourished, claims of assassination, of silencing, of hidden agendas. Most serious historians reject those theories. But what remains undeniable is this. Patton foresaw a confrontation with the Soviet Union. Within 4 years, NATO would form. Within 5, the Cold War would harden into military standoffs. Within 10, West Germany would be rearmed, under American guidance. The very scenario Patton had imagined would unfold, only later and under far more structured conditions. But in 1945, suggesting such moves was political dynamite. Using Nazi gold to accelerate that process? Unthinkable. The gold itself was eventually returned, piece by piece, to governments and claimants through painstaking legal efforts. Some assets remain disputed to this day. But for a brief moment in history, as Allied soldiers stood in salt mines beneath Germany, the future balance of power seemed to glimmer in stacked bars of stolen metal. And one American general believed it should be used before the world realized the next war had already begun. By the summer of 1945, the guns in Europe were silent, but the arguments had only begun. Berlin lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. Rail lines were twisted steel. Cities were hollowed shells. Across the continent, the question was no longer how to win the war, but how to shape the peace. And in that fragile vacuum, George S. Patton's warnings no longer sounded like battlefield bravado. They sounded like prophecy. The uneasy alliance. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union had always been one of necessity, not trust. American officers who interacted with Red Army counterparts reported growing tension. Soviet forces were stripping factories from eastern Germany and shipping them back to Russia as reparations. Political arrests were mounting in Poland. Anti-communist leaders were disappearing. To Patton, this was confirmation. He had toured occupied areas and heard first-hand accounts from civilians. He had observed how swiftly Soviet political officers embedded themselves into local governments. He understood ideology when he saw it. And he believed the West was moving too slowly. While Washington debated international frameworks, Stalin was establishing realities on the ground. Patton's argument was simple, even if it sounded extreme. Power respects power. If the United States failed to consolidate Western Europe immediately, financially and militarily, the Soviets would dominate by default. The captured Nazi gold represented speed. Money meant momentum. It could stabilize currencies collapsing under post-war inflation. It could prevent food riots. It could support anti-communist governments before they were swallowed by internal chaos. In Patton's mind, delay was weakness. Eisenhower's burden. Eisenhower carried a different weight. He was not just commanding armies, he was safeguarding the fragile architecture of peace. The Potsdam Conference in July 1945 underscored how delicate the situation had become. President Truman had replaced Roosevelt. Churchill would soon lose the British election and be replaced by Clement Attlee. Stalin remained steady and calculating. Every gesture mattered. Every policy decision signaled intention. If the United States appeared to repurpose German assets for unilateral advantage, the Soviets could interpret it as economic aggression. The alliance could fracture before occupation structures were fully established. Eisenhower believed that even if Patton's concerns were valid, the method was wrong. International legitimacy mattered. America had fought a war claiming moral high ground. The handling of Nazi gold had to reflect that. Committees were formed to track stolen wealth. Financial experts cataloged bullion serial numbers. Art historians sifted through looted masterpieces. The process was slow, meticulous, bureaucratic. Patton called it naive. Eisenhower called it necessary. The German question. Behind the debate over gold lurked a deeper issue. What would Germany become? The Morgenthau Plan, an early proposal, had suggested turning Germany into an agrarian state to prevent future militarism. Factories dismantled. Heavy industry removed. No possibility of rearmament. Patton thought this was catastrophic thinking. He had studied the Treaty of Versailles. He believed crushing Germany economically after World War I had created fertile ground for extremism. Starvation breeds rage. Humiliation breeds nationalism. If Germany were stripped too severely, something worse might emerge. Or worse still, it might fall under Soviet influence. Patton envisioned a different path. Rebuild Germany quickly, under Western oversight, and transform it into a defensive partner rather than a broken liability. To many Americans in 1945 this sounded absurd. Germany was the enemy. The Holocaust had only just been revealed in horrifying detail. Public opinion demanded punishment, not partnership. But Patton was already thinking 10 years ahead. A growing divide. As autumn approached, Patton's public comments became harder to defend. He criticized aspects of denazification, arguing that removing every former Nazi Party member from public life was impractical. In reality, millions of Germans had been party members, many opportunistically rather than ideologically. His phrasing, however, was blunt. Too blunt. Journalists seized on his remarks. Headlines framed him as sympathetic to former Nazis. Political pressure mounted. Eisenhower faced a choice: reign in his most aggressive field commander, or risk broader instability within the Allied command structure. The reassignment to the 15th Army was decisive. Patton was effectively removed from influence over occupation policy. Officially, it was about discipline and public relations. But strategically, it also ensured that post-war planning would not veer toward confrontation prematurely. The intelligence undercurrent. Even as Patton was sidelined, American intelligence agencies were quietly reaching similar conclusions, though more cautiously. Reports from Eastern Europe described Soviet consolidation. The OSS, predecessor to the CIA, analyzed political patterns in Poland and Romania. British intelligence was already planning contingencies for potential Soviet aggression. In fact, British Prime Minister Churchill had commissioned Operation Unthinkable in mid-1945, a theoretical plan for possible conflict with the Soviet Union. The plan was deemed unrealistic. But the fact it existed at all proved something important. Patton was not alone in his suspicion. He was simply the loudest voice saying it out loud. The gold's final destination. The vast majority of recovered Nazi gold was eventually transferred into Allied custody and distributed through established restitution programs. Some went to national governments. Some returned to central banks. Some remains, particularly assets taken from Holocaust victims, became the subject of legal battles stretching into the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The process was imperfect. Records had been destroyed. Ownership was murky. Justice was incomplete. But the gold was not used to rearm Germany in 1945. It was not converted into anti-Soviet funding. It remained officially what it had been seized as: evidence, reparations, moral accounting. Patton's death and the shadow of speculation. On December 9, 1945, Patton's car collided with a truck near Mannheim, Germany. He suffered a spinal injury that left him paralyzed. 12 days later he died. He was 60 years old. The timing, so soon after his removal and amid growing Cold War tension, sparked decades of conspiracy theories. But no credible evidence has ever demonstrated foul play. Still, history has a way of amplifying irony. Within 4 years NATO was formed. Within 5, the Berlin airlift would pit the West directly against Soviet pressure. By 1955, West Germany was formally rearmed and admitted into NATO. American policy ultimately moved toward what Patton had envisioned, though under careful political choreography rather than battlefield urgency. The difference was timing. In 1945, the world needed recovery. By 1949, it needed containment. Patton simply believed containment should begin immediately. The larger question: was he reckless? Or was he early? History rarely answers such questions cleanly. Patton's temperament made his ideas harder to accept. His lack of diplomatic restraint undermined his strategic foresight. He was a warrior speaking into a room preparing for peace. But beneath his bluntness lay a fundamental concern that would define the second half of the 20th century. What happens when yesterday's ally becomes tomorrow's rival? The debate over Hitler's gold was not really about money. It was about the shape of the post-war world. It was about whether power should be consolidated swiftly or legitimized slowly. It was about fear. And about foresight. In the end, the gold did not decide the fate of Europe. But the argument over it revealed who already understood what the next war would look like. Deep inside the salt mines of Germany, beneath layers of rock that had formed millions of years before Hitler was born, sat the stolen wealth of a collapsing empire. Bars stamped with eagles. Coins melted from nations. Jewelry torn from wrists and cattle cars bound for camps the world was only beginning to comprehend. It was the physical remains of tyranny. But it was also something else. It was leverage. And leverage, in 1945, was the most dangerous currency on earth. George S. Patton looked at that gold and saw not just restitution, but urgency. He saw a continent on the brink of political vacuum. He saw Soviet armies entrenched from the Baltic to the Balkans. He saw hunger, chaos, and exhausted populations vulnerable to radical ideologies. He did not believe peace would hold simply because papers were signed. He believed power had to be arranged, stabilized, fortified, immediately. In his mind, waiting was risk. Procedure was delay. Committees were luxury. The war had proven that speed wins. He did not intend to hoard Nazi gold for America's greed. He intended to weaponize it for America's security. To him, the difference was obvious. To others, it was reckless. Because in April 1945, the world was not ready to pivot from liberation to confrontation. The public still saw the Soviet Union as a blood-soaked ally who had borne unimaginable losses to defeat Hitler. Stalin was difficult, yes, but necessary. Suspicion existed, but it was muted beneath victory parades. Patton was already thinking about tank divisions facing east. Eisenhower was thinking about preventing another war entirely. And that difference defined everything. Eisenhower understood something Patton did not, or perhaps refused to accept. Wars do not end cleanly. They taper. They cool. They settle into fragile arrangements that require patience as much as strength. If America had immediately repurposed captured Nazi assets to fortify Western defenses against the Soviets, the message would have been unmistakable. The alliance is over. The next conflict has begun. In 1945, such a signal might have shattered Europe before it even stood up again. Occupation zones could have hardened into armed borders overnight. Soviet reprisals in the East could have intensified. Cooperation over prisoners, refugees, and displaced persons could have collapsed. The atomic bomb had not yet reshaped global calculations in full. Japan was still fighting. The United States could not afford instability on two fronts. Eisenhower chose restraint. History would call it prudence. But restraint has a cost. Within months, the cracks Patton feared began to widen. The Soviets consolidated power in Poland. Political opposition was crushed. Elections were manipulated. The Iron Curtain, as Churchill would soon call it, descended across Europe. By 1947, the Truman Doctrine openly declared America's commitment to resisting communist expansion. By 1948, the Berlin blockade tested Western resolve. By 1949, NATO was formed. By 1955, West Germany was rearmed, precisely as Patton had once suggested might become necessary. It happened more slowly, more carefully, wrapped in diplomacy. But it happened. The Cold War arrived not with a declaration, but with accumulation. Containment became official policy. Reconstruction funds flowed into Europe through the Marshall Plan, billions of dollars stabilizing economies to prevent communist influence. And here lies one of history's quiet ironies. The United States ultimately used immense financial power to fortify Western Europe against Soviet expansion. Not Nazi gold, but American gold. Patton had been wrong about the method. but perhaps not entirely wrong about the direction. Still, it would be simplistic to cast him as a prophet misunderstood. Patton's flaw was not foresight, it was impatience. He viewed history like a battlefield map. Identify the next threat. Strike before it consolidates. But geopolitics is not cavalry warfare. It requires timing, legitimacy, public readiness. Allies must move together, or not at all. If the United States had appeared to exploit captured Nazi assets for strategic gain, it might have undermined the very moral authority it needed to lead the post-war world. The handling of Hitler's gold mattered symbolically. It proved that looted wealth would not simply change hands again. It would be accounted for, tracked, returned where possible, even imperfectly, even slowly. That moral accounting distinguished victory from conquest. Eisenhower understood that perception shapes power as much as tanks do. There is another layer to this story, one rarely discussed. Patton was a soldier forged in relentless forward motion. War gave him clarity. Objectives were defined. Enemies were visible. Momentum was measurable. Peace is murkier. In peace, yesterday's allies become rivals. Moral lines blur. Political calculations replace tactical ones. For a man like Patton, peace may have been more disorienting than combat. He saw the Soviet Union clearly as a future adversary. But he struggled to accept that the transition to that reality required stages. His instincts were offensive. Eisenhower's were stabilizing. Both were shaped by experience. Both were products of the same war. Yet they saw the aftermath differently. Patton's death in December 1945 froze his image in time. He did not live to see NATO formed. He did not witness the Berlin airlift. He did not watch American troops stand permanently stationed in Germany, not as conquerors but as protectors. He did not see West Germany transformed into a democratic ally. Had he lived, would he have felt vindicated? Or would he have clashed again with the slower, deliberate architecture of containment? We cannot know. What we do know is that history often unfolds somewhere between the impatient and the cautious. Between the general who sees the next storm gathering, and the commander who insists the sky must clear before sounding the alarm. The gold itself remains a haunting symbol, not because of its value, but because of what it represented. It represented the scale of Nazi plunder, the systematic theft of nations and lives. It represented the moral debt left behind by genocide. And in that tense spring of 1945, it represented possibility. To some, it was restitution. To others, leverage. To Patton, it was a tool that might secure the future. To Eisenhower, it was a responsibility that must honor the past. The debate between them was not simply about bullion locked in vaults. It was about the soul of post-war leadership. Would America act as a stabilizing power bound by process? Or as a strategic power willing to preempt the next threat at any cost? In the end, America chose process first, and power second. The Cold War was fought not with looted treasure, but with structured alliances, economic aid, intelligence operations, and ideological endurance. It lasted decades. It did not erupt into World War III. Perhaps that restraint mattered more than immediacy. There is a final truth in this story. History often remembers battles more vividly than debates. It remembers Patton racing across France. It remembers Eisenhower accepting Germany's surrender. But it rarely remembers the quiet arguments over what to do with victory itself. Yet those arguments shape the world just as profoundly. Because winning a war is only half the struggle. Deciding what to do with the spoils, financial, territorial, moral, is the other half. And that decision determines whether peace becomes stable or temporary. Hitler's gold sits now not as a war prize, but as a record. A reminder of theft, of atrocity, of accountability attempted. It did not fund a secret anti-Soviet army in 1945. It did not ignite an immediate East-West clash. Instead, it became part of a slower reckoning. Patton saw the next battlefield forming. Eisenhower saw the current one still smoldering. Both were right in their own ways, but only one controlled the timing. And in history, timing is often everything. The vault doors in Bavaria eventually closed again. The bars were counted. The records filed. The treasure dispersed. But the argument over what should have been done with it echoes far beyond those tunnels. Because every victory carries a choice. Use power quickly, or legitimize it carefully. Strike the next threat early, or wait until the world understands it too. In 1945, America chose patience. The Cold War would prove that patience had its own kind of strength. And somewhere in the long shadow between triumph and tension stands George Patton, staring at mountains of gold, already preparing for a war that had not yet officially begun. That was what stunned Eisenhower. Not the gold, but the glimpse of tomorrow hidden inside it.